3D Lab guest sessions are online technical talks or collaborative workshops hosted by the 3D Lab based at Wimbledon College of Arts. We seek conversations that reflect the richness of thinking through making, technical research and development, and practical learning and teaching. We aim to provide a learning resource and develop an archive for a community keen to articulate tacit knowledge and making literacies that underpin making practice. For previous sessions, please visit wca3dlab.myblog.arts.ac.uk or follow us at WCA3D Lab on Instagram.
The lab sessions were started back in 2019, pre-pandemic, and have always been in somewhat collaboration with Clare Mitten, who we're going to be talking to today. Clare is gallery coordinator of the Wimbledon space, but is also working with the CCW Galleries team in their online scheduling during the pandemic. She sits within all these wonderful, interesting roles, which we'll slowly unpack a little bit in this session, but particularly about how to access making as a way of thinking, as a process to prototype ideas and thoughts, but also how to navigate different materials and objects and relationships. And one of the projects that we actually collaborated with Clare on is the residency of Foster and Hayes last year. There's some particularly interesting things that came out there in terms of helping Foster and Hayes do a survey of the new performance environment at Wimbledon College of Art. But it spoke to how Clare kind of really is the glue between all these wonderful elements of making spaces and showing spaces, and often sits in the background of these kind of really interesting events and performances that occur. And so today we get to kind of turn the spotlight onto Clare a little bit and unearth some of the amazing thinking that is behind her practice, as she also sits not only as the glue between these spaces as research, but also as a maker herself, and more recently a trainee art psychotherapist at Goldsmiths, which has created a lot of interesting conversation, certainly between Clare and I recently. So and also just thinking about how that relates to how we navigate new relationships within the performance school, and what's the context of that, thinking about story, narrative, gesture, performance, but with making and materiality and play at the heart of the inquiry, really. So without much ado, I want to hand over to Clare so she has enough time to kind of unpack with us some of these interesting elements of her practice.
Thanks so much, Ash, for that lovely introduction. Yeah, as you said, it's a bit strange to be on the other side of the fence today, but yeah, hopefully there'll be some stuff of interest to people listening. Okay, I'll crack on and share the screen. So yeah, so Ash said, you know, I sort of span these different roles at the moment. So at University of the Arts, my key role is as gallery coordinator, which I do 2 days a week, and that was primarily at Wimbledon space, which at the moment, due to the building works and also the pandemic, isn't programmed. So I'm working very much with the CCW Galleries team at Chelsea Space and sort of online programming. I'm also artist maker and trainee art psychotherapist, and hopefully today throughout this sort of presentation there'll be sort of a lot of threads that kind of weave back and forth between all these different roles. Particularly sort of different and interesting processes, really, fundamentally, in all sorts of ways, in materials and how they perform, what their qualities are and how they can be used, how they don't perform and how that can be interesting as well. The spaces between things, inside and outside, and objects and things. So I have a real curiosity about objects and using them as an anchor. And as soon as I start trying to recreate them in different materials, they kind of lose their specificity and become quite ambiguous, but absorb these other references. So that's, yeah, I guess this space between things is quite fundamental. Just to touch on a couple of projects that we did at Wimbledon Space. We used to have a bespoke white cube gallery space that some of you will remember. And when that shifted to the corridor space in the original foyer, it was a real opportunity to kind of exploit quite an uncomfortable site for, you know, what's usually a kind of showcase of very sort of finished artworks. But certainly with the sort of nature of Wimbledon moving towards performance and theatre, it felt like a really good opportunity to use the interactivity of that space as a kind of provocation, really, in thinking about, I guess, whether works are on the wall or on the floor, and how people have to navigate that site of making and what the artworks do. This image here is Paul Westcombe working in the space. He did a residency and completely transformed the space with wall paintings, with a massive theatre gauze. Paul is an artist who studied painting. He then went on to study scenic art at RADA. And this project was really of interest because of those different territories of fine arts and theatre. And also he brought in an opera singer, a playwright, and some dancers. So it was a beautiful cross-disciplinary, multi-collaborative intervention in the space. Yeah, so this was the private view. And then obviously Will Waterhouse, part of the tech team, did a beautiful project called Epic Win, which again was like really exploiting that opportunity for interaction within a kind of gallery, sort of hybrid residency, experimental kind of test space. So again, a kind of between space that makes usually the private space of making very public. So yeah, these shows felt very generous to me in terms of like the artists revealing their processes, and particularly this one with Will, you know, this inviting people to play with his works and a kind of ripple effect of creativity that he created. So not only the artist himself sort of making these works and these kinetic sort of sculptures and videos and animations, people walking through the space, staff, students, visitors were invited to, and really did enjoy sort of interacting with the works. My newer hat is as a trainee art psychotherapist and training at Goldsmiths, and sort of trying to get my head around sort of lots of new theories, really. And I guess, Ash, you talk about, you know, the guest sessions and working with students as creating these holding spaces, and sort of working therapeutically with people is very much about creating these holding spaces and these using theories as sort of frameworks, really, through which to kind of understand and think about things and be in relationship with people and think about things with them together. One of the key sort of theorists that I'm really interested in is Donald Winnicott. And so he has sort of some key ideas that are relevant to sort of art psychotherapy and psychotherapy generally, but also to art making and artists and ideas of play. And that's this idea of sort of the space between the internal world and the external world, and how as children we begin to navigate the shift from the inside, or being, I guess, joined with the mother or the primary caregiver, to being a kind of separate individual, and the use of sort of transitional objects. So say a kind of soft cuddly toy or a soft blanket that helps with that transition. And thinking about, I guess, metaphorically, there's lots of crossovers with artists and making, and how we use our practice and making objects and images as this kind of in-between space between our internal psyche world and the external world, and trying to understand the space that we inhabit in the physical world. This is Winnicott on the left here on the bottom. He invented this thing called the squiggle game, which you might have heard of. So I, excuse my artist skill on the right. This was like a little squiggle that I had a go at, and yeah, kind of what he would do is he would invite the child to draw a little squiggle, and then there would be this dialogue of he would then continue the squiggle, and then the child would continue the squiggle, and together there would be this kind of free association of what came up, and it would be a way to start sort of entering, I guess, the subconscious and the unconscious. Okay, so yeah, as a maker, I sort of primarily see myself within a sort of painting context. That's the kind of discipline within which I've studied at the Royal College. I don't always paint in the traditional sense. So this was when I started at the Royal College, and I feel like it's kind of interesting to show because it felt like a bit of a regression, and sort of certainly thinking about art psychotherapy now, I'm wondering about these kind of suspended objects, quite playful objects, being my own transitional objects in that context of being in a new space, a new college with new people, and kind of bringing parts of sort of older work that I'd made and wanting to kind of move it forward, but kind of not quite sure how to do it and feeling a bit self-conscious. But thinking about, using these familiar materials of biscuit trays, chocolate boxes, straws, bags, and palettes of play, I guess, as well, like felt tip pens, then colours of plastic and plastic toys, which feels like it's a kind of language of childhood, really. Yet trying to reference ideas of science or kind of spontaneous life, or thinking of maybe viruses or space satellites, or maybe just these psychological structures that have these kind of twisted, tangled straws, or this precarious sort of sense of suspension. And yeah, this is an old shot of a studio space that I had sort of before a sort of project at Canary Wharf, and I put it in because it just shows the approach to making, where I'll have, I'll know what the context is, and I use that context, and I'll kind of have lots of ideas about the kind of territory or objects that I want to kind of reference. So in this case, it was technology and mobile phones and laptops, but not quite sure what it might become. So what tends to happen is like lots of objects and images and paintings start coming into being in parallel, and then they all start sort of ricocheting off each other, and then I'll sort of, maybe one thing holds my interest or starts absorbing more references, so I'll go with that more than the other thing. So a lot of it gets left by the wayside, and it can be quite an inefficient way of working. But I think it probably needs to be. It needs to have the opportunity for like all of those different sort of pathways to be explored. Yeah, so this was the context, Canary Wharf, this like massive marble filled building, and inside, these were a suite of objects that kind of referenced the building itself, the site of Canary Wharf, being in the city, and the sorts of people working in finance in that kind of area. So these sort of 3D bar charts bit like a three-dimensional spreadsheet, or sort of stocks and shares and ticker tape, and a chip and pin machine with a kind of racetrack till receipt. It's all, yeah, all quite, I guess, whimsical, but starting very much with a very specific object, like a camera, a laptop, a phone, a chip and pin machine, and then through using materials of paper, cardboard, glue, the kind of impossibility of recreating those to kind of the high spec. So along the way, as the glitches and corruption of those materials, and the lack of dexterity, in a way, using that as an advantage to kind of crack these objects open and see what other references might be contained and how that might link to the kind of context of the exhibition. Short story by E.M. Forster, The Machine Stops. If you haven't read it, it's a beautiful sort of premonition, really, of our current, or our last year of sort of navigating the world through the screen. But this particular quote really struck me, and I guess working with technology and the slickness of our contemporary sort of laptops and screens, and how shiny and perfect they are, and this idea of a fear of direct experience and the real world and getting things dirty, and go back to this idea of making with kind of glue and cardboard and a sort of lo-fi cut and paste, how that kind of the rips and the tears and the smears of the glue, and that all corrupts the surface, which I really enjoy, actually. It's quite a hard quest for me to get the right kind of aesthetic. So it's a very particular fine line between having the thing, like it's trying really hard to be the thing, like this is like trying to replicate the idea of a laptop, which also becomes a kind of mobile phone, but also a typewriter, and playing with this idea of like all these separate jumbled separate components of the buttons, are kind of the opposite end of the laptop, which is all contained and portable. This, you'd have to open up and individually set up all these individual buttons. Yeah, so I use sort of model making and construction. That's usually the first thing that happens as part of my practice. I sort of tend to think in three-dimensional sketches first off, and I need a model to work from. So then quite often I'll use painting or drawing with gouache on paper as a way of, sometimes it's a way of understanding the object as they're being made, to kind of view it through a different sort of filter, if you like particularly painting, I find it has a slowness to it, like it's particularly gouache, the way I work with it, it's almost stroked onto the paper. But sometimes the paintings or the drawings, they're very much a record of these temporary objects, really, that exist in all their multiple components, and it's a way of reintegrating these the multiplicity of lots of different objects, which are kind of like I guess a mini installation within one flat image. And this, yeah, thinking about diagrams, there's a medieval diagram of a war machine, I think. It's in a book about oblique drawing, and I just love it, that idea of a flat image being able to convey multiple sides of one object, so that you can communicate to somebody looking at it as much information about all those facets of a thing that you can, and yet by doing that you're distorting the object. And I kind of really enjoy that sort of paradox. Back into that idea of starting to make an object, and so this is sort of in the studio in flux, trying to make a projector with slide carousel boxes that then sort of start suggesting a kind of tank, really, but making a painting of this carousel, which then starts suggesting, I don't know, like some kind of space odyssey wheel, or on a micro scale, maybe a diatom. And again, that, you know, thinking about models in particular as having this potential to have an ambiguity of scale. So, you know, then they don't have, they can be really specific, but, you know, if you have a model, it tends to be this kind of tabletop handheld size, and it could be a model for a giant architecture, or it could be a model for, you know, the tiniest thing, or it could be a model blowing up something from a microscope or a plant part. So this is how those works manifested in an exhibition space, and thinking about how these different works have threads of connection between each other in the way, in the language of making and the visual kind of components of each thing. Back in the previous image, the kind of tank projector had the same kind of links as this kind of version of a Rolex watch. And there was, yeah, a kind of military feel, I guess, and a kind of cartoon caricature of a man's very expensive Rolex watch, and trying to use paper and quite crude materials to replicate, you know, the shininess of those really desirable objects. And yeah, the way these units are repeated and take so much time, that the kind of the ticking of the clock implied in the object is sort of mirrored in this kind of insect sort of tick tick tick, snip 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 of the sort of cutting of the scissors as a sort of cut and pasted all of these different bits together. Yeah, an image from Fritz Lang Metropolis reminded me to think about or mention, yeah, that idea of labor, I guess, and a kind of work ethic. And although these objects sometimes look like they're quite quickly made and quite crude, they're actually really lovingly made and repetitive, time-consuming, yeah, repetition of these quite laborious objects. Yeah, Ash, we I think have had some conversations about this idea of objects becoming things, and this Duchamp piece of the bicycle wheel just seemed to kind of really speak to that. You know, having sort of components of these recognizable things, you know, the stool, the bicycle wheel, but neither of them, when they're taken out of context and put together in this new way, can function as they are. So you see both of those things in a completely new kind of aestheticized way. You see the beauty of the wheel, you see the structure of the stool, and the idea that you know, this bike wheel still has movement, but it's not going anywhere. And then, yeah, like an enjoyment of, or a fascination of, objects, and sometimes historical technologies as well as contemporary technologies, and the difference between them being, you know, this enjoyment of being able to see the mechanisms, that this superficial kind of beautiful glossy skin that houses the workings of our current machines are laid bare in the sort of, you know, the 18th century. So this is Harrison's clock, and it has these sort of beautiful plates between which all the mechanisms of the clock are kind of, you can see them doing their job, almost like, you know, got all of these different dimensions. So it's both 2D and 3D at the same time, which I really enjoyed. A version of that object. Yeah, and that ideas of cross sections, and this image just showed really well, like an interest to have again in like this idea of the cross section and revealing something. Yeah, the I guess the tension between the surface of things and what that surface contains. So the idea of the inside and the outside, and sometimes the discrepancy between those two things. which I guess as a trainee art psychotherapist is something I'm sort of really interested in. And Winnicott talks about true self and false self, and how, you know, we construct these ways of being that to be compliant and to be feel like we're accepted in the world, and actually, you know, this mask hides other stuff going on beneath. This is a really great book for descriptions of surfaces of things or objects in the world, and this particular quote I really enjoy about escalators. And it made me think of the Canary Wharf lobby, actually, with all this marble and glass and escalators and handrails, and just getting really seduced by almost like a mindfulness of noticing these the qualities of different materials, actually, that we usually just, you know, walk through without really engaging with. And this, so this is a little portable radio that I have in the studio, and in trying to replicate it, it felt like it sort of took on all these other sort of objects. And this is a gouache painting of the cardboard model that I made, and it just felt like it becomes this, from the specificity of that digital radio, it starts becoming, I don't know, like a little Mars rover or something, or like a little pilgrim with a staff going on some kind of exploration. And the colours of the cardboard, just, I guess enjoying sort of reading into those colours, the way the light and shade sort of hits it, and seeing these almost colours of technology, really, a kind of plasma-y, reflective kind of colour. Yeah, kind of perversity of trying to replicate things, objects that are extremely precise and rely on their precision to function in cardboard and paper. Yeah, I'm not quite sure why that holds the fascination it does, but I guess it's like embracing the failure, or a kind of pathos that, you know, it's never going to quite be the thing, but a real enjoyment of working with cardboard and paper, and the qualities of that material being something, I guess, something democratic and accessible, something that's usually non-precious and that we think of as lo-fi, but is actually pretty high tech in the way it's produced, you know, to protect things. And that cardboard and packaging are these containers and units and modular units that you can build things with. So yeah, so this my version of the Babbage machine was constructed on a kind of a remade cardboard cutting mat, which kind of nodded to the process of making and sort of cutting these things out in the studio on a real cutting mat. And then this giant floor piece, two-dimensional floor piece, was almost like I imagined it like an instruction manual, but it became like an architectural sort of prototype, or large sort of illuminated manuscripts, or carpet page of a manuscript. Those were the sorts of things that I was thinking about. Yeah, and then I've been thinking about wanting to paint plants, and this object, start looking at sort of plants in my room, this kind of object, the Babbage machine, thinking about how these plants, you know, have a structure and a system very much like a machine, really, and making a watercolor of a money plant, and then that watercolor itself starting to suggest the colors of what do you call them, the chipboard, not chipboards, microchips, and technology. And then that making me think, well, actually, yeah, plants are really high tech as well, you know, their leaves are like solar panels, and then the different qualities of making in different ways. So the watercolor, when it becomes a template for a collage that's sort of cut and glued, has a very different quality, and it becomes something that has almost like these like camera lenses that might sort of I don't know, move or chop maybe, and unpicking objects through making them, remaking them in paper and cardboard. So this shuffle, sort of when you unravel it, it contains these kind of platonic solids, the circle, the triangle, the square, as you know, you can see in this Kepler model from the 16th century. And this was a gouache from that. I'm just flicking through quite quickly now, so I'm aware of the time, Ash. And yeah, so models of plant parts remade in cardboard. So this was a tulip pistil that then becomes a bit like a kind of satellite, space satellite, or a spore. And dissecting plant parts to try and understand them better. But the paradox of doing that is that in wanting to find out stuff, you kind of destroy the very thing that you want to find out about. And this was an installation of a project at the William Morris Gallery called Plant Works, thinking about, yeah, oversized models of dissected reproductive parts of plants, so stamens and tulip pistils, pollen spores, making diagrams from biology textbooks of the pollen making part of a plant, a cross section, making a version of that in 3D out of paper files, just to see, just out of a curiosity, I think, to see what it might look like and to know what it might look like, and then wanting to paint that in gouache to see what happened then and how did that change the object, and then using that painting or drawing as a template for a large-scale collage, which became this kind of, yeah, thinking of it as a pollen factory, with these sort of units that kind of rotated around these 4 sort of locules, I think they're called, in the cross section. And then on the right, a sort of cross section of a model of the large papier-mâché pod that becomes like a kind of viewing platform. So they start feeling like prototypes or blueprints for maybe some kind of architecture. And again, just showing the process, that kind of tertiary process, a 3-stage process between the model making, the making a painted drawing, and then translating that into a collage. And there is the pod. And I think this is the final one. Sort of during lockdown, I've been making a lot of these honeycomb studies called filter exercises, just as a way of trying to help my concentration, really. Particularly at the beginning of lockdown, it was quite difficult to sort of focus and get any kind of concentration going. And these were, you know, just enjoying a quite straightforward copying of something, a piece of cardboard honeycomb in front of me, but enjoying that shift of sort of 3D to flat, and then, you know, just the kind of piecing together of these different shapes and colours that then rebuilds this 3-dimensional form. That's my full stop kind of papier-mâché pollen spore brain.
Amazing. I think that's a brilliant place to pause and just pick out some themes. I think what I'm trying to formulate in my mind, which your work just does so incredibly well, is this language of thought made physical in some shape or form. And just thinking, you know, I mentioned Foster and Hayes, the duo that you worked with in the Wimbledon space, and they one of their fundamental questions is the material of performance, and what is that? And I think there's some sort of answer, in the sense of just, maybe not answer, but maybe prompting or suggestion in your work, in the sense of understanding the psychology of relationships, or understanding the subjectiveness or the objectiveness of being in body or embodied in relationship to other objects around us. I don't know. I don't know if that makes sense, but I just wondered if you had anything more to kind of extrapolate on that, in terms of this act of making, as a sense of making sense of these contexts that you find yourself in, or the particular promptings, for instance, like the satellites or the plant structures, or but also just the psychology element of, like, actually this could be making sense of our role in the world as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think definitely the process of making something is very much, you know, once you start it, you're entering something that you're not quite sure where it's going to go, or I'm not, you know, that's the way I think I know, but then there's a kind of letting go of expectation, I guess, and then it becomes a dialogue between, you know, what you're thinking in your head as you're making and the materials, or switching. I mean, there's the left and the right side of the brain. I can always get it muddled up which is which, but you know, I think it's the right side of the brain which is very much a sort of creative, kind of imaginative, emotional part of the brain. So I think when we're making, that's the bit that's kind of active, and it's almost like the other bit is shut off, or you have to kind of shut it off to stop that kind of well, in psychotherapy you'd call I guess Freud would call the super ego, the critical kind of parent voice. It's the work that sort of begins to evolve in front of you has both of those, you know, that dialogue from inside and the materials doing their thing. And then as you're noticing things happening, you're kind of, I think your subconscious is kind of making decisions, or you trust your subconscious to make those decisions, and then having moments sort of stepping back, and the left side of the brain can kind of critique or evaluate or think in more of a kind of conceptual, cognitive way about what's happening. So I think, yeah, that relates to kind of working as an artist, working as a, you know, a trainee art psychotherapist, those two different, integrating those two different ways of thinking, really.
I think you, in our previous chat leading up to today, I think you might have mentioned it when you were talking about the machines, and actually earlier machines would really be made to kind of show their workings, whereas we're a lot more in industrial design right now is much more kind of slick and concealing of how it's made. But you had this term of, like, it's a perverse use of the wrong material, which I quite like the idea of, but actually there's an economy of using materials, and actually I think it is, you know, I can see what you mean by that, because the objects are trying their hardest to be something that they can never really be. But at the same score, there's like a good economy, use of economy of that material doing what it needs to do. It needs to show up as a way of as a thinking material, and in its sense, it's actually fulfills the correct use of the material. You know what I mean? But it just made me think about prop making, and how this, you know, and you mentioned model making, and the idea of the artifice trying to be real, and not quite making it, or exposing the real of the reality of the artifice, or vice versa. But yeah, I just wondered if you could speak more into, I guess, the use of material, and actually exploiting like the beauty of cardboard as a structural material that serves its purpose, it does what it needs to do. But also that kind of the fiction and the imaginary versus the real and the gritty, as it were.
Yeah, I guess, yeah, I guess when I make these objects, that's the thing as a viewer that you're confronted with, or that I think when they work well, what happens is you're looking at this thing which is kind of familiar. You might go, oh, that we might, is that a laptop? Doesn't really look like a laptop, but it kind of feels a bit like a laptop, or maybe it's this, or maybe it's that. So you have all of these things going off, but then you come back to this idea because of the handmadeness and the kind of physicality, I guess, of those rough those materials that have been, they have been cut or ripped or pressed or glued or smeared or torn, that you're reminded that this is just cardboard. And so you're aware of like this kind of being in both places at one time, I guess, that your imagination hopefully takes you to, oh, this is a laptop. Oh no, it's really not. It's just a pile of made kind of little cardboard buttons, or yeah. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, it just makes me think of Kubrick using like marbled paper to like show like sequences of space, or like the pen on a piece of acetate that's like floating to kind of show get the sense of zero gravity. This. But I guess what's interesting about your work is like it doesn't propose to have the slickness. It like really is happy about that pen being on a piece of acetate, or like the marbling process, and shows it as it is.
Yeah, I think, and this may be why I'm really interested in the art psychotherapy, partly, is that it's about an enjoyment of the metaphor and using analogy and metaphor to understand things and making links that way. So it's sort of staying with this kind of as if, or staying in the kind of influxness of stuff, rather than, I guess, casting something in bronze for me. Although I enjoy bronze sculpture or works like that, but I think, yeah, for me, I'm more interested in the aliveness of the process and sort of keeping that as part of the work. So I guess, yeah, it's about a kind of a model has as a prototype. It has this potential, doesn't it? That you're not dictating what it's going to become. It's always staying in this potential space, as Winnicott would call it.
Which is interesting in the context of Wimbledon with our theatre designers, or like the act of making models for the potential or for the proposal of them becoming real in some shape or form. And actually, when we're working with those students, it's trying to tread that line carefully between like promoting like ambitious use of theoretical space within the model, but then also pertaining to how that's going to be realized in the physical, thinking about the properties of materiality and what's suitable for a kind of realized aspect. But I think you mentioned this, the interesting part about models is that kind of balance between the ambiguity of scale, that it can be quite specific or speak into the specific, but there's also something about the translation of the prototype that could be something else as well. I just wondered if you could speak into a bit of that about the play of scale, like you were looking at cellular, like plant cells that sort of then can become things that look almost like motors, or I don't know, apartment blocks, or but yeah, I wondered if you could speak into the use of scale or the play of scale in relation to traversing that idea between the real and the physical, the real and the imagined and the in-between of those two things.
Yeah, I mean, I guess talking about the props, it made me think of props becoming, these sets for theatre. We're all in our different ways in the business of like creating a kind of illusion or kind of trying to open up the imagination of an audience or a viewer, or communicating something that, is very subjective, isn't it? Everyone brings their own references to looking at these things, and their own references to how they relate to like given materials, or what their associations are. I think we have some universal or cultural associations with different materials that are shared, and then we have more sort of personal narratives that become sort of embedded in the work. So it's trying to remake sort of plant parts in cardboard on a larger scale. It was, you have this suddenly aware of like the sophistication and the elegance of the original of the natural world, and that it's impossible. It was impossible for me to sort of replicate it. So it very quickly became something other. I've not quite cracked the sort of working with sort of natural organic forms cardboard, actually. Whereas with sort of technology, the structures that cardboard sort of quite easily makes, those sort of geometric kind of structural building blocks, it works quite well. But when you've got like natural forms, or at the moment I'm trying to make sort of papier-mâché shells, and actually trying to make this kind of spiral organic structure with something that's very sort of rigid and angular is like a riddle. And that's where the interesting is. It's like when you come up against those real problems, I know there's something really interesting to explore and mine there, but I haven't cracked it.
But also as like using model making as a way of understanding the intricacies of something, I think that in itself is quite interesting. I mean, in the lab sessions, we're always trying to really articulate the making literacies or the principles underneath making, or those kind of ways. How do we problem solve through making, or what is the value of thinking through making? And when you were talking about Will's work with the Epic Win, you were talking about the kind of private space of making being made public, as it were. And I guess a bit of these lab sessions is trying to do that, to kind of really name and articulate and bring it into the forefront, instead of it just being an end result or an initial concept, is really to give value to the actual process of making. But Arantxa Villas, one of our speakers back in April, she talked about fiddling, like purposeful fiddling, because her approach to making was sort of a consistent reflective practice, as it were, or a bit about creating archives and exploring different types of dyeing processes, and almost kind of an archive of experiments, really, is probably how she would refer to some of her work. And I'm just thinking about that in terms of your approach to making, in terms of this making it explicit on how the object is made, but also in doing so kind of revealing a bit about your approach to making in the consistency of making to figure it out in some way.
I like Arance's description of the fiddling, and definitely I'm aware of like making, there's a kind of the repetitiveness of like fiddling or doing something with the hands, making these sort of repetitive components and units allows a space for thinking about, you know, the next thing or what the next thing might be, or other things, you know, like keeping the hands busy. I mean, there's a psychoanalyst called Darian Leader who's written a whole book on hands and gestures and what we do with our hands, and you know, the history of, you know, having a handkerchief or something in the pocket before mobile phone always got to be, you know, in a way our hands have always been busy doing stuff. There's something about when you make a model of something or you're trying to replicate something, you have to really look at it. So it's about a real scrutiny, enjoyment of looking to try and understand and to try and remake. And then, yeah, I guess sometimes the closer you bring that object to a likeness of the object, in a way, the further away from it becomes as well. So that has, yeah, I guess that links the idea of a kind of intricacy becoming quite surreal.
Yeah, and also I think one of your terms of phrase in our previous meeting was like failures of making made deliberate in some way. And I wondered if you could share about what is failure in the sense of making, or you know, and actually having looked at your work, one could argue that there's no failure, that actually the falling short of something is actually part of the work. But I wondered, how do you view failure? How do you incorporate it? How does that work within your making process?
Yeah, I mean that can be quite problematic, can't it? Because if anything goes, then anything goes, and there's no kind of unit of measure of success. But I think the embracing of failure is more an enjoyment of seeing where the materials help me deviate from it just being a copy of the thing, which could be, I mean, it could be really seductive and exquisite, or it could just be really dull. So I enjoy failure because it introduces something unpredictable or unexpected into the mix. But there's definitely a real quest for a specific result, or I think I keep remaking things or moving from object to image back to object to collage, because it's a quest to kind of get it right or find the right kind of aesthetic of the object. And I know it when I see it, but quite often it takes multiple versions of that thing and then kind of cut and pasting from those different versions into a new hybrid thing to kind of get thing. So yeah, it's a process of sort of editing and then introducing and then editing out, so you have a bit of control over what the references are that are contained within this thing, but not obviously whole control, because the viewer will bring their own subjective references.
I mean, you also had a term called when you were talking about your initial was the RCA beginnings of the chocolate boxes and those experiments, talking about the palettes of play, so like straws and these like waste products, or you know, wrappers and things. But I think that's a really lovely term or phrase, like what is a palette of play? What are the tools of play or the materials of play? And I guess that's what we're trying to uncover in these sessions, is like, what's the palette of making, or like what is what are the tools, or what are the approaches? But I think the essence of play being the center some of your work, or would you say that that's a core practice, or could you speak about how play involves or underpins your approach to making in some way?
I think again, sort of like going back to Winnicott, he talks about play as like being in this kind of transitional space, as we begin to navigate the world. That's how we begin to understand it and become separate and kind of work things out. So it's, and then that leads into the way that we like sort of symbol formation and how we kind of start understanding what objects are, or other, our relationships to other people are, and how we're separate from them. And and then that, that symbol formation leads to language and creativity and culture. So there's this kind of, it's all replay. So like culture is basically, it's a very sophisticated version of playing. Do you think?
Graham in the chat just said, sort of commented on light illuminating the objects that are studied and made, link them as well. And actually, I didn't think about that, but actually there is a strong element of light in your work, as and light could be a theatrical kind of device, or illuminating device in some way. But I just wondered if you had anything to say about the use of light in thinking about the made object as well as the 2D image painted object.
Yeah, so it's mainly like I've definitely become aware of like the light and shadows on the models when I'm making the sort of drawn paintings of them, and then those shadows are a way of introducing sort of different colours, actually different sort of coloured areas, that then when they get reintroduced into the object, they become absorbed into the object as a part of its structure or as a part of its surface. So not necessarily the shadow, but part of something else. So I'm kind of interested in that kind of the illusion of that, but also how it disrupts, it starts abstracting from the original as well. So it's making a shadow that's something insubstantial, isn't it, become a kind of solid somehow.
Claire, we can talk for absolute ages. There's so much to draw out, just practically as well as theoretically, but also, just entering this new world that you're kind of learning about in terms of Winnicott theories and the psychotherapy, but, in terms of how the psychology of making and the process of that helps us to kind of navigate the world, actually, or make sense of ourselves as well as the environments that we found ourselves in. So I definitely feel like we probably need a part 2. But just to say thank you so much for your time in developing or just putting together some thoughts for us and giving us a real kind of overview into all these like different roles that you play, and how making plays a really good role, or a kind of the role of glue in between all these processes.
Thanks very much, Ash.
So just a formal thanks to Claire. Do check back on our blog, give us a follow at WCA 3D Lab on Instagram if you see fit. And this just leaves me to say have a really good summer, and we hope to be back with you in the autumn term